didn't do that bad and relatively speaking did well is because their terms of trade, despite some losses, still were kept very strong during 2008 and 2009. So with all due respect, my Brazilian friends are overestimating their degree of success. I think they should be more realistic, that they have been very lucky about having this availability of resources and have these good terms of trade, but they, as we Mexicans, should not be counting for that in the future. And this is, of course, a call for the recovery of a very strong process of reform in Latin America along the lines that Santiago was mentioning and that he has been working very hard. One last point, using my privilege as chairman, of course, Don Gerardo.
What can I say? I mean,
no. Well, yes, it's true, Padma, that the U.S. has to play a key role in any of these reforms. I would say a leadership role in a way. But that doesn't mean that the ideas that are being generated in the U.S. political system are going to be very useful ideas. So, you know, you can have good leadership if you produce good ideas. But you can also have very bad leadership. And if you see what has been done in the U.S. In climate change, for example, this ridiculous cap-and-trade system that is being considered in the U.S. Congress, well, that would be very bad leadership. If you look at the things that are being said in terms of financial regulation, I think it will be a disaster for the world if, as a result of this political horse trading that is taking place in the U.S., they produce their financial reform, and then the world is asked to harmonize their financial regulations according to that disaster. Well, the U.S. has to have leadership, of course, based on its power, but also on sound initiatives. And right now, we are not seeing that. And this is not a criticism, of course, to President Obama, who I think has done his part in this game, but it has to do with the broader U.S. Political system. And this, a final point, because I think it's very important, Jerry. Here we have a situation in which international conditions, our diagnosis point very clearly towards the need of having better international coordination. The problem is that domestic politics, today primarily driven by unemployment that is very high and probably will stay high for a number of years, is going to conspire very strongly about against the adoption of what would be rational decisions at the international level. And I think this is a fundamental predicament that will bring about a very serious tension that I don't know yet how it is going to be solved.
Okay, so we start, thank you very much. We start with the series of questions from the floor. We will take five questions, then we'll have the panelists to answer, and then we'll have another set of 5 questions. Please raise your hands. And yes.
I would like to ask the panel if you think that there are any lessons from European governance that could be learned for global governance.
Okay, this is one question. You, please. Yes.
Yes. I have a question to Professor Desai. She mentioned the abolition of the division between investment and commercial banks. It's mentioned very often recently as a reason for the financial collapse. Now, I don't understand that argument very well, and I was going to ask you, is the problem, do they claim the problem is that these banks were allowed to get bigger by allowing them to operate in both markets? Or is it something inherently problematic with the bank that invests and accepts deposits? Thank you.
Boris? Yes.
I have 2 or 3 quick remarks. One is on the root causes of the crisis. I think it's definitely a huge regulatory failure rather than the imbalances of. I mean, the imbalances didn't help here, but the imbalances were there for a long time, and they will stay, as we see now after this crisis. But it was really a huge regulatory failure of the financial system, which will now be, to some extent, in a way, mended. But we'll see how far we go with both the proposal in the United States and the BAL committee, because we will calibrate the BAL committee proposals now with the banks, and we'll see in the second half of this year how far that will go. It might be, my suspicion is that it will be to a large extent watered down, and that we'll still have not perfectly regulated banking system, but will make a huge step forward. In terms of getting a kind of international regulator, that's not a realistic and feasible option. Simply, financial centers will never give up the full financial regulation to a supranational body. In the financial industry, concentration is such still that there are huge interests in keeping lots of the domestic regulation. In terms of the IMF proposal, I think it's a good proposal, but there are also many problems with it. First, the IMF, it's very difficult for IMF to be a true lender of last resort, putting the unconditional liquidity on the table. If you look at the central banks, which act as lenders of last resort, they have huge resources. They have infinite resources. IMF doesn't have. They cannot print money, so it's impossible to put unconditional sums of the liquidity on the table. You have to have some kind of conditions. And second is you can still create a moral hazard. Central banks can regulate those to whom they act as lender of last resort. IMF cannot. So the probability of the moral hazard is still higher. And, well, I'll stop here.
Thank you. Anupam, yes?
Question I have, that I disagree that global imbalances are a fundamental source, but I think they are more a symptom, and it's a pity that the Asian perspective in that sense is missing on that. But focusing on the regulatory regime, I'd like to ask that, the issue today, the name of the game is macroprudential. That's what the IMF words they use. They have also, their own research has pointed out certain dilemmas that faces. Most likely now the goals of macroeconomic stability and financial stability may no longer be congruent. That creates a fundamental problem of this thing. We cannot take solace in the issue of fundamentals. One, because of the reasons that Santiago said, they didn't turn out to matter. Two, because in some ways they might be individually rational but collectively irrational. So as a result, I'd like to ask each of you, or any of you, to point one significant change that has occurred that actually addresses any of the causes of the crisis going forward. Otherwise, I think Professor Zedillo is right. The next crisis is within the decade and to be more virulent than the one now.
Mauricio, you want to ask? Yes? You want to ask?
Thank you. Well, I really enjoy Francois' analogy between the financial regulation and the climate change issues. I want to push you a little bit further in that direction. You could think of this idea of introducing a global Tobin tax as something that has some resemblance to a global carbon tax. I think we understand somewhat why a global Tobin tax is not viable, is not feasible, and that probably has something to do with what countries think is excessive capital flows, and the fact that some countries have lower levels of capital, say capital to labor, and they need those capital flows more to have convergence in levels of income or in living standards. So I want to push you in that direction because it may be the case that the carbon tax, the global carbon tax,